thank you for coming back. My hope had originally been that we would have some time to share some of the stories that I heard in my group, and I'm sure you heard in other groups, about the ways in which people, teachers, mentors, coaches, faculty members contributed to the lives of all of the people who are here, and probably are part of the reason that we are all here together now and think the way that we do. I heard stories about how to love the students that are walking into your office, how faculty opened the doors to things that were never imagined before. And somehow I think all of us are able to do that in a way that has contributed to our long-term well-being and in fact to our happiness. So with that, I'm going to, because we're now at the appointed time, I'm going to hand this off to Rick, who's going to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Lori Santos from Yale University, and then we will hear from her. Go ahead, Rick.
Thank you, Keith. And hi, Lori. So good to see you. Thank you for joining us today. I want to take a minute or two to introduce Lori to you. If you don't know her, you probably should. She is one of the most well-known people in America that deals with young people and deals with happiness. So we're just really privileged to have you share this time. Lori is the Chandrika and Ranjan Tandon Professor of Psychology and head of Silman College at Yale. And I think this being head of Silman College plays a role in her interest in students and what we're going to talk about. She was trained at Harvard and focused on what makes the human mind unique. Dr. Santos is an expert on human cognition and cognitive biases that impede better choices in life. Her course, Psychology in the Good Life, teaches students how the science of psychology can provide important hints about how to make wiser choices and to live a life that's happier and more fulfilling. It's a lot of surprising outcomes from this course. Her course recently became Yale's most popular course in over 300 years, with almost 1 in every 4 students at Yale having attended this course. She ought to have her own commencement when the students leave. Her course has been featured in the New York Times, the NBC Nightly News, the Today Show, GQ Magazine, Slate, and O Magazine. She's a winner of numerous awards, both for her science and her teaching. She's recently voted as one of Popular Science Magazine's Brilliant 10 Young Minds, and was named in Time Magazine as a leading campus celebrity, which I think is an understatement. Her podcast, The Happiness Lab, has over 35 million downloads. I don't think I can even count that high, much less have people pay attention to what I've been doing. So I think this coalition's focus on well-being and the arc of well-being over all of life is a really big goal. It's a moonshot for us in higher education. It's the central role that mindset, attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs play in education that is the core of what we're trying to get our arms around. I first met Lori in person in, I think it was February of 2020, just before the wall came down and we could no longer fly, in Georgetown at a meeting that the Mary Christie Foundation has about student well-being. And I found out about her story of how she became involved in this, and about this Coursera connection with Yale, and about something called Yale Face. I think it was Penn Face that was the discussion at the time. So what I'd like to do, Lori, is to just interview you for a while and ask you a few broad questions so that you can share with us your background and your learning. So my first question is, how did you become engaged at Yale with designing this course on happiness? And how did that course impact others at many other universities?
Yeah, well, it really did start in that role as a head of college on campus. I've been teaching at Yale for over 20 years, which makes me feel very, very old. But just in the last couple of years, I took on this new role as a head of college on campus. So, some of you probably know this, but Yale's sort of one of these strange schools like Oxford, Cambridge, or Hogwarts, right? Where these like colleges within a college. And our residential colleges are really a central part of like campus life, right? It's like programming happens there, a lot of student life stuff happens there. And heads of college are faculty members who live in the college with students. So I eat with students in the dining hall, I see them in the coffee shops and so on. And I think when I took on this role, I naively assumed that student life was like happy and, filled with joy and parties and stuff all the time. And then when I got into this role, I was really seeing, this college student mental health crisis up close and personal, right? Where I saw just so many students who were depressed and anxious, lots of incidents of suicidality, but even when we're not at the level of clinical mental health dysfunction, just so many students who are stressed and feeling overwhelmed. And, I'd ask how it was going. I was like, oh, if I could just get to midterms. And it felt like they were just kind of constantly so time famished that they were sort of fast forwarding their college time. And it really affected me. I mean, one of the things about these residential colleges is these students kind of feel like my family. I feel like this benevolent aunt who's sort of taking care of them. And it felt like, we really needed to do something about this stuff, and I think as educators, this is sort of preaching to the choir a little bit given who I'm talking to, but I think we forget that students' well-being is part of our job, right? In the sense that we can't educate students. They're not going to learn about economics or Chaucer or computer science or whatever it is if, like 40% of them are too depressed to function most days, and over 60% experience overwhelming anxiety. I mean, that's what the stats are nationally at colleges right now. Like, they're not learning in the way we think they're learning. And so I realized I wanted to do something about it. I'm a academic psychologist by training. So what I figured I could do was I could teach a class on this stuff. I could develop a new class where I, figure out these strategies. And that was easier to do than I expected, in part because, we know a lot over the last 20 years in this field of positive psychology and a lot of work in social psychology and beyond about just strategies you can use to feel better, strategies you can use to kind of overcome things like depression and anxiety and so on. And so I kind of packaged them all together, in a class. I assumed, it was a new psych class on campus, 30 or 40 students would take it. And so you could imagine my surprise when the first semester I taught it became the biggest class ever at Yale. Yale doesn't have a kind of pre-registration period. We have this sort of shopping period where people kind of pick as you go. And we have this little, ticker that you kind of can look at, this little website that's telling you about enrollments. And I realized that we had a problem when, most of the graphs of enrollments go from 0 to 100 and they kind of hover down at the bottom, but they had to actually change the scale on mine automatically. So mine was going from 0 to 1,000, and then they had to bump up past 1,000. And I was like, something is very wrong. So we moved the class to a concert hall. There was talk about whether we would cap the class, but our administration kind of got it. They're like, we don't want to cap this class that's giving students strategies, good strategies for happiness. In fact, my dean at the time was like, we will be on the cover of the New York Times of Yale kicks students out of happiness class. We have to find a way to get everybody to take this class. And so we kind of, worked it out. It was a little clunky, but yeah, in the end, we had a quarter of the entire student body taking the class, and had really gone viral on campus. But what I found so surprising was that it went viral not just on Yale's campus, but beyond. We are one of these universities that whatever we do, good or bad, is going to wind up in the New York Times, for better or for worse. But this was a case where we wound up in the New York Times for something good, where the story really was, look at these Yale students who are, 19 years old, they're at Ivy League university, they've got everything made, and they're not flocking to classes on investment banking or computer science. They're flocking to classes on happiness, what's going on, and it really kind of became a sort of national conversation, I think, about what's happening to our young people, that they kind of need this stuff. So yeah, so that's sort of the story about how it got going. It wasn't necessarily planned, but it made me realize that I'd hit a niche, right? Students really like this stuff. They were voting with their feet on our campus. They wanted strategies they could use to feel better. And I think they wanted evidence-based strategies. They didn't flock as much to classes on the good life in the humanities and so on. I think they really wanted, what does the science say about the kinds of things I can do to change my behavior to do better?
Oh, that's marvelous. And I think it's an indicator on the dashboard for all of us about what could be going on our campuses. So that leads me to ask you to speculate, what is your assessment of why this course was so surprisingly popular? And why is it that students today have this obsession with trying to understand the science of well-being and happiness?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's just a real hunger for feeling better, right? I mean, they don't like this culture of feeling anxious and depressed. They know something's wrong, right? They get it. I even talk nowadays, to other high schools and middle schools and things, and it's already, some of these mental health issues are already happening there. And I think they get frustrated that they've been, sold a view of like academic success and success in life, maybe more broadly, that's like not allowing them to thrive. They feel like if I just, don't sleep and I don't, hang out with my friends and I study, 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 then I'll get into the perfect school. And then, I don't know, I'll like get out of the perfect school and get the perfect grades and I'll go to the perfect medical school and it'll be perfect, perfect, perfect. And then like, I'll tick everything off and my life will be great. And I think, what they're seeing in the trenches is like, this isn't working. They're watching their friends do that and their friends are having, episodes of depression and suicidality, and they're just like falling apart. Even the ones, again, that aren't going through like clinical levels of mental health dysfunction are just like stressed and burnt out and feeling overwhelmed, right? And so they're kind of getting that it's not working. And I feel like offering them a solution that's like, hey, this isn't working, but here are some strategies that really will work. I think they just kind of really resonated with that and they really kind of crave it. Another thing I'll say is that, many of you are in positions of thinking about well-being on campuses, and we're often in a position of wanting to do like programming for students or just like, come up with like different, activities they could do at night and yoga and these things. And we on Yale's campus have tried that stuff too, obviously. But I think there was something about saying that these things were within the context of an academic class that legitimized them, right? Like these are strategies that Yale thinks is so important. We're going to give you a grade for this stuff, right? And I think that legitimized some of these well-being practices in a way that other sorts of programming didn't. It wasn't just some like 8 o'clock thing on Sunday off to the side. It was something that we really like thought should be part of the curriculum. And I think that kind of mattered for them. It sort of signaled that normatively this stuff matters in a different way than some other projects might have in the past.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I can tell you from the community that I've been involved with for the last couple of decades, one of the fastest rising elements of the college budget is the cost of psychological counseling for young people today. And this has caused a great deal of anxiety and worry, and no one seems to have exactly the answers as to why it's going on. So your course appears to provide a recipe for things that you can do about this as a student, and it's based on science, which I think is really helpful to all of us. Now, this community that's meeting here, the Coalition for Life Transformative Education, is a group of like-minded people who are interested in trying to move the needle to change well-being in our college alumni years after they leave college. Now, I realize this is not exactly what your course was about, but we can't resist the temptation to ask you to speculate on what things we should be thinking about from your perspective to make a difference there.
Yeah, well, one question I get a lot, which is sort of related, is like, I taught them all this stuff. Did it help? Right? Did it help in the trenches while they were still there? And the whole experience, as you can imagine, like it's going to be 30 people, it's over 1,000 people. We don't have enough teaching fellows. We don't know where to teach it. The New York Times and the Today Show and NBC News is coming in to film it. I was just white knuckling the entire, and like, for those of you who are faculty, like, this is a new prep class. I hadn't finished it. I was like, what is happening? So what I didn't get my act together to do was to do a really like IRB approved pre and post survey of these students, versus a control group of students who weren't taking the class, to ask, did it statistically improve well-being? We just like didn't get our act together to do it. Anecdotally, I can tell you, I still get emails and thank you letters from students who took the class that say it's completely changed their life, especially with COVID kind of coming on the heels of my first teaching the class. I think so many students were like, the strategies I chose to use to kind of get through this crisis were different because of your course. And so thank you. So anecdotally, it seemed to help, but we didn't actually test it out. We were, however, able to test it out in some of the subsequent versions of the class that we did. So as Rick mentioned, we put the whole class online on Coursera.org for anyone in the world to take it. There's now 3.5 million people who've taken the class, which is humbling and incredible. But there we actually had some bandwidth to sort of set up like a real scientific study to ask if it was working. And so the way we did it was people who take the Coursera class can opt into being in the study. They get a survey at the beginning of the class. It's a sort of standard survey that people in positive psychology use to measure well-being, what's known as PERMA. And then they get that at the end of the class. And we were able to use a control condition because Yale also teaches other psychology classes on Coursera, like just take intro psych. And so we had the intro psych students do it too. So they're both taking a psychology class, but like one's getting all these kind of happiness tips and the other's not. And so what we find, which is kind of cool, is that in both classes, well-being goes up from the beginning to the end of the semester. So just kind of getting through a class and finishing it is like good, for your well-being and your sense of meaning. So 2 thumbs up. But what we also find is that the boost in well-being you get from my class is bigger than just a regular psychology class. On average, we were finding the specific boost that comes from this happiness class was about 1 point on this sort of 10-point PERMA scale. So what does that mean? That means if you started out as like a 6 out of 10 on happiness, you might leave the class with strategies that got you to a 7 out of 10. But that is like immediately after the class. We haven't yet been able to kind of survey people 1 year out, 5 years out, which I think is some of the goals of what a lot of you are talking about, which is like, how can we give students lifelong strategies that are really going to help them? The hope is that, maybe these kinds of things stuck, but these are kind of current studies that we're waiting to do. We kind of have to wait. This is the problem with human studies. It's not like a rat where they grow really fast. You have to wait the 5 years and then come back and survey people. But the hope is that, people just write saying that these things have changed their life, that they were suicidal before and now they have these strategies to do better, that 2 years on from taking the class, they're still meditating or exercising or whatever it was. And so I think there is reason to suspect that some of these things might hold really for the long term. And that's exciting for 2 reasons. One is, what if we could seed these kinds of skills early, early maybe at college, but early maybe before college. Now imagine them getting it in middle school before they wind up at Olin or somewhere else, right? So they kind of know these strategies ahead of time. But the other cool thing is that, these are strategies that we're presenting in an online format, right? These people can just take this class online. And I think, we could quibble about, obviously it would probably be better to do it live and in small groups and so on. But this, approach suggests that what we can do is we can scale this, right? Which I think is another problem, right? One of the reasons so many of those mental health services are so expensive is they tend to be one-on-one approaches or small group approaches. You need, one counselor per student, and that gets really expensive. But if there's ways that you can give these strategies at scale, even if they give a smaller benefit than probably it would to have one-on-one therapy with someone, that small benefit at scale can probably give a large benefit, for less money. And we're doing the thing that universities do best, which is we're teaching students academic content. So like, win-win all around.
Oh, this is fascinating. This provokes about a dozen new questions, which we don't have time for. So let me just take advantage of a little bit of the opportunity to talk to you personally before I open the questions for everyone. One of the things that is very interesting to me is the fact that you went to Coursera with your course soon after you launched it at Yale. Some would feel that this is going to raise some complications because inherently mentoring and helping students feel better about themselves requires building some kind of personal relationship. And Coursera is not an in-person sort of environment. So you are one of the few people I know who's had experience in both. You've taught this material with people at Yale face-to-face. You live with them in the residence hall. You can see it and touch it. On the other hand, you also have hundreds of thousands of people that take this course online. What insights have you gained about the effectiveness of trying to teach this sort of material online? Does it work? How does it work? Is it the same as doing it in person? Is it better than doing it in person? Is it not as good? What can we learn?
Yeah. Well, we're only now starting to get some data on this, right? We started with the Coursera data set. We've also been getting some data about a live version of the class from a different university, working with the University of Bristol in the UK. Professor Bruce Hood, who's there, has been doing a version of the class, and he's using slightly different metrics, kind of some of the well-being measures that are more typically used in UK studies. He's sort of seeing similar increases for a live class. But I'll say a couple things about that. So one is that when we filmed the online version of the class, we did it in a slightly different way than is typical for a usual Coursera class. It's not just me in front of like a green screen kind of talking about this stuff. We actually set up a little salon in my house where we had about 20 students from my residential college who came and like listened as I talked about this stuff. So the way it looks on Coursera is literally me talking to a group of very diverse students who have their own questions. So it's almost like the Coursera learner is sort of like participating as though they were a Yaley, and not in my kind of big, huge class, but in this sort of small group where people are asking these intimate questions. And we get a lot of feedback on Coursera that that's one of the things they liked, is that people feel like they're kind of like plopping into this intimate group of students, kind of having this one-on-one with me. So it's we haven't done the scientific research of like, green screen versus intimate group to test what works, but my sense is that that helps, even though it's a big online class. But another way to answer the question is just, what the science shows is that these strategies work if you do them. And these strategies, I mean, the kinds of things we teach in my course. So making sure you get social connection, doing random acts of kindness, focusing on mindsets of gratitude, finding purpose, using your character strengths, healthy habits like sleep and exercise and meditation, like focusing on activities that give you more of a growth mindset, things like that. And so these standard practices, I mean, the science shows it works if you do them. And so the question is like, how can we get people to do them? I think that the one-on-one might be a kind of way to sort of put some social pressure, or it's like really gets to students and so on. But I actually think one of the reasons the class works is that it presents students with the data for this stuff. It's not just like, oh, I'm going to give you some meditation programming. I'm like, hey, look at this graph. Here's what's going to happen to your well-being. If you do the 5 minutes of meditation every day, here's what's not. And I think when people see that, college students and even our adult learners on Coursera, they're just like, okay, I don't want to be here on the graph. I want to be here, right? And so seeing the data, I think, can really help people make a decision for themselves that this is worth investing in, right? And use some strategies themselves to sort of put this into effect. And so, I wish I could multiply myself so I can be in tiny classrooms all over the world, but that's like 3 million classrooms at this point. It's like a lot. And so I think if we can find things that scale, they can be really powerful. Again, they probably on average are giving less of a boost to well-being for every individual, but a small boost for lots of people, I think, is making a big difference. And it just sort of starts people on the path to better habits.
That's very helpful, very great insights for us as we're trying to scale this across a wide range of different campuses, from large public research universities to small liberal arts colleges to technical schools and everything in between. So we're going to have to extrapolate a little bit from your experience and try it. You mentioned that we just don't have the data from 30 years ago to know how this works. The surrogate that we've been using actually is a Gallup study that they did with Purdue. I'm sure you know about this, the Gallup-Purdue Index, which is a correlation study. It's not a causation, but it correlates what alumni can tell you they remember from their undergraduate experience with their well-being today. And so our compass direction right now, as we're starting on this journey, is to try to emphasize those undergraduate experiences that we know correlate with the outcomes. And I'm sort of wondering if you know of other kinds of studies or other things we should be thinking about as we're trying to identify the compass directions for the work that we're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think, this isn't exactly the exact answer to the question I think you were looking for, but I think, one of the things I think universities need to think about a lot are what's the barriers to some of these kinds of things, right? So some of the kinds of things I sort of include in our compass, as it were, are things like social connection, sleep, getting in some exercise. I don't think these are things that are naturally hard for our students, right? Like these are the things that are just kind of like human nature would cause you to do if you didn't have something else in the way. But I think the problem with modern universities is that there's a lot of other stuff in the way. These are over-scheduled, overworked students who are doing, like spending a ton of time on schoolwork, perhaps more time than they need to because they're so anxious and so stressed about it. They're spending a ton of time on extracurriculars to the point that if you talk with students, they often hate them because they're feeling so overwhelmed by them, right? And in some ways, it's like, the students might naturally gravitate towards the stuff that works if we could take some of the barriers, out of place. And so I think as you think about the compass, it might not be, well, what kinds of activities do we build in, but what are the kinds of things we need to take away? And this has become really salient to me in my role as a head of college on campus during COVID. So I'm not sure what's happening at all your universities. Last year in 2020, Yale sort of kicked out the sophomore class, so they were studying at home. We had the first years on campus just for a semester, and everything was on Zoom. So they could be on campus, but they're not doing any live stuff. And pretty much all extracurriculars, sports, everything, a cappella, which is really big on Yale's campus, all that got canceled, right? So there's none of that stuff. And I was expecting this to have a huge negative impact on students' mental health, right? I mean, I even very publicly said, I don't know if they should be back on campus. What are we doing? Blah, blah, blah. What ended up happening was interesting. I mean, it was a stressful year, right? It's the middle of a pandemic. These students come in with mental health issues and so on. But I saw two things that were really interesting. So one is that I think students were so burnt out on screens that when they had free time, they were much more present and social with each other. They talked about doing the thing that I remember from college, which is like staying up into the middle of the night, like, chatting with their roommates and BSing about crap, right? And just like talking and being present with one another. They were present with each other at meals, right? Which they kind of had together outside when they could, but they didn't want to like be on a screen and working. They were so starved for human contact that they kind of did that naturally. The other thing was that I think students were way less time famished than normal. There's lots of social science evidence that your feeling of time famine can really negatively impact your well-being. One study by Ashley Willens shows that if you self-report being time famished, or you just don't have time for things, that's as big of a hit point for point on your well-being as self-reporting that you're unemployed, right? So think of the like meaning, purpose, kind of well-being hit that comes from being unemployed. And if you self-report just like not having any time, that does that. And I think because there were like no extracurriculars and sports, like students just like had more bandwidth. They would talk, like I would see them like in the courtyard, like reading a novel, not for like a class, but just like to read a novel and things like in the ways that they just never did. And so again, kind of getting back to like, what do we take off their plate? I think this is really interesting to think that, what have we done by kind of packing our universities with every single opportunity ever, every possible language class, every possible sport and extracurricular. We might be setting up students for this like FOMO that's going to cause them to like pack their schedules too far. So what would it look like to have a like cap on the extracurricular? You can do one sport and one singing group and that's it. You're just like done, right? Or have a cap on the number of classes they take and things like that. Again, I think figuring out ways to take stuff off students' plates might be better too.
Well, this is wonderful insight. I'm just struck by a number of comments that you made. One of them is the business of getting people who are incessantly driven to try to do more and more and more, take more, make more credit hours than anybody else on in the floor that I'm on, more extracurriculars, and then compare that with what we look at when we do admission universities. It seems that this is maybe heading in the wrong direction, that the people who we give preference to are the ones who have more on the resume, which really points in another direction. And that is, in order to deal with this, this is not just a professor of psychology's problem on campus. This is the entire campus that needs to come together. So you need cooperation across the institution with other faculty members, with the staff, with the administration. So the question I have is, inherently what you're doing is, in my interpretation anyway, you're making a plea to the institution as a whole and your colleagues that in order to make headway on this, we have to broaden our mission beyond transferring knowledge and skill. We now have to be willing, because we are always, whether we're aware of it or not, in taking responsibility for shaping mindset, shaping attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs in students as well. But this is not always a comfortable conversation with faculty colleagues. And I'm sort of curious, how have your faculty colleagues reacted to this course? And how do you feel about the success in persuading them to join you in this effort?
Yeah, well, I think we can sometimes get in this framework of either or, either we're committed to transferring knowledge or we're committed to, transferring knowledge plus this other stuff. Actually, if you look at the scientific work, I think there's that distinction doesn't make sense. Like every available study in positive psychology suggests that the transferring knowledge part, the getting them to think innovatively, getting them to think creatively, getting them to just learn stuff, that's all going to work better if they're in a good mental health space, right? There's evidence that if you get medical school students like in a good mood, they're going to find the creative solutions to medical problems more quickly. There's evidence that if you put people in a position where they're suppressing their emotions, they're suppressing their negative emotions, that's going to cause them to do worse on memory tests and do worse on decision-making tests, right? Like not paying attention to students' mental health when they're in this much distress, with 60% of students reporting that they're overwhelmed overwhelmingly anxious, right? Think of when you're overwhelmingly anxious, like what are you retaining? Like not very much. Are you performing well on your exams and stuff? No, right? And so I actually think that, it's not, and this is kind of how I've met faculty colleagues and talked about this, right? This isn't an either or. Like we are just not going to succeed in our mission well, if we didn't take care of this. And we know this from other domains. We'd never be like, well, let's just get rid of the dining halls. Dining halls super expensive, all this staff, food waste. Let's get rid of it. They just won't eat. You'd be like, no, well, they can't learn if they're not eating, right? Like we feed them because that's the way to like get them to learn in part, right? And I think it's the same thing when we're thinking about their well-being, when we're thinking about their mental health. Like this is a level of mental health dysfunction that we are simply not doing our job. And I think my faculty colleagues, if we're being totally frank, have seen that. A lot of students will self-report that students aren't doing as well in their classes as they were 10 years ago, that they're not coming up with as creative paper assignments. And that's in part because they're just triaging everything. How could you not, if you're kind of in that mental health space? And so, yeah, so I think the messaging for folks who aren't naturally on board with this is like, there's no distinction between these missions. This is our mission. Even if the only mission you thought was transferring knowledge and not setting up beliefs and mindsets, which, bracketed, hopefully we have faculty colleagues who don't think that. But even if you thought that was it, you still need to pay attention to this stuff, because ultimately, if they're not there in terms of their mental health, that's going to constrain what they're going to learn.
Yeah, well, this is an extremely important message. Some of our audiences for the folks that are involved in this coalition aren't on campus at all. They are, for example, boards of trustees and legislatures who support higher education in general. Understanding the science of happiness, understanding the condition of learning today on campus is a very important conversation to have. It's one that not everybody on campus has responsibility for, but some of us do. And one of the consequences of that is that there's sort of a generational issue here too. If you're really young, and so I'm just make this as an odd benchmark. If you grew up after the iPhone, you don't know what the world was like before that. And it just sort of seems like everything is digital and Facebook always existed. If you grew up in my generation, I mean, this was like when we just invented the wheel, a lot of things look surprising. And so it leads you to sort of speculate, what's happened? How did so many young people become so obsessed with anxiety and depression, overwhelmed? I mean, in my generation, we worked hard. There were stresses too. We've had wars before, we've had all kinds of things, but we don't remember these issues coming up then. So why are they coming up now? Is there something fundamentally different about society today? Is parenting in America different than it was 2 generations ago? Does Facebook play a role in this? We don't know. And while it's not central to knowing what the right thing to do is, it is helpful to be able to explain this to stakeholders who are not native to campuses. And I know this is probably not what you wake up and think about every morning at breakfast, but I'm just
No. I mean, honestly, it really is, right? Like, there's been an enormous causal change between like my generation, which I like to think, I mean, it was a long time ago, but I like to think it wasn't that long ago, right? Like between my generation and the current generation of students. And we have to ask the question, like, what happened, right? Like what happened so we can figure this out? And I think you're right. Like there's not going to be like a silver bullet, right? A bunch of things happened, right? Parenting did change. There's a wonderful book by Julia Lithcott-Hames about helicopter parenting. And she goes through that in the 80s, like we kind of changed around how anxiously we parented. That was like the stranger danger time, and people are putting, like horrible things in people's Halloween candies, playgrounds are unsafe, seatbelts, we need to build those in, right? Like there was a kind of anxiety and a protectiveness that got built into parents, like kind of societally, that sort of changed around whether you could just like be a free range kid and wander home like after school, right? Like that just doesn't happen in the way it happened for us. And some of those changes are good. I'm not saying they're all bad, but they're structural and real sociological changes. She also points out that, at the same time, the kind of rhetoric about college changed, right? It became kind of much more mandatory in a way that it might not have been in our generation. And I think the kind of push for meritocracy changed, right? There was this idea that there's, certain colleges were the good colleges and the spoils of war go to very few. And if you could add more and more and more admissions, committees like that, I think admissions committees did like that. There was probably a change there too, where they like being more and more selective because that looks good over time, right? And so, students had to kind of ramp up. And I think parents got very anxious about the possibility of their kid getting left behind, right? And so that change was true. And then on top of that, you have, the beginning of these devices. If you take the graph of college student depression, anxiety, suicidality, pick whichever bad thing you want to look at, and you map it onto the number of iPhones in American society, like that correlation is striking. We know correlation is not causation, but like, wow, that looks pretty tight, right? And I think if you think about what these devices have done, it's really changed around a number of features of what it means to be on campus. We had a speaker, we do these kind of teas for our students where it's kind of like a fireside chat. And we had a former Yale alum who came and talked about kind of life in Silliman College where I live. And he pointed out this thing that I never really thought of. He was saying that, his suite, that everybody called his suite by like 424 or whatever. And like, that was the phone number in his room where people could like call his room and call. And the students were like, wait, there were phone numbers attached to our room. And we started talking through what it meant to have a cell phone. It means you can never be off, right? Your friends can always find you. You can always be posting something on Snapchat or TikTok. Like, it wasn't like back in the day when I was there where I could like leave my room and go to the library and study, and no one thought they could get in touch with me. There was no norms of me being on. I could kind of be off the grid in a way that our students never are. The performativeness of kind of being on all the time gets even worse when you're performing in lots of different ways. You mentioned this idea of pen face, or sometimes it's called duck face, where you're showing off. A duck is like one of these creatures that like, it looks like it's very calm on the surface, but if you look underwater, it's like paddling so frantically. And this is the idea of pen face. You kind of put on this fake face on the outside, but on the inside, you're falling apart. And these tools that our students have that they're posting on all the time kind of allow them to do that in a way that's different. And they can't walk away from them in the same way that we walked away from a phone. You have to, the students talk about like, if you leave your phone in your room, it's making a statement. That's performative in a very different way, right? And so, that was just something we never saw. And it's not just the need to perform, it's, anxious notifications about emails that are coming up, or, stuff that's happening in the world, right? Like, they're not kind of controlling the input of information. And a lot of that information is anxiety provoking, in part because it's designed to be anxiety provoking, because that's what captures our attention. And the economy now is an attention economy. So I think, that was a long-winded way of responding, but I think there's no silver bullet. There's lots of changes, but so many of them are out of these poor students' control, right? They didn't kind of fall into them. And any of us who was exposed to this stuff would react the same way. We sometimes, I'm sure all of us kind of get this idea of like, oh, these snowflakes, like, what are they so anxious? Like, we went through world wars and, Vietnam, and like, what, and it's like, those things were bad and tough, but, these students were raised in a different way than we were. And they're kind of exposed to sort of stressors that are different and maybe psychologically taxing in a way, that the previous generations didn't get. And so, yeah, I do think understanding these things, it would help us. I don't know if we can shut off some of them, but I think it'd make us knowledgeable about what happened and how we can think about with admissions or with the kinds of structures that we in colleges and in college administrations control, how we can do better.
That's so insightful. I'm so glad that you shared that. That gives me a new narrative in talking to people in my generation and those who are in governance at universities as well. I think just the simple idea that you can't shut the world off and reflect and provide the time for your brain to process. You constantly have to be performing, should developmentally raise some red lights on the dashboard. The other one, of course, is the lack of confidentiality, the lack of barriers, the lack of an ability to make mistakes in life without permanent consequences. All this is different for the next generation, and thank you for articulating that. I'm going to open this up now. I'm going to be a little bit less greedy with the opportunity to talk to you and allow our whole community to ask questions. So I would suggest that everybody who's in the audience, if you have questions for Lori, put them in the chat, and that way I can be processing them while she's answering them. We already have a couple of them. Let me begin with one from a member of our steering committee, actually. This is the provost at Wake Forest University, Rogan Kirsch. And rather than reading this, Rogan, I think it might be better for you to personally ask Lori the question. We are not a huge group here today. Why not do this face-to-face if our technical folks can make that happen?
I didn't honored. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, you are.
Big thanks for absolutely fabulous presentation of actually taking your course and stolen large parts of it for my own classes. So thanks as well in a plagiarizing, admitting kind of way. I was dropping in a chat point as you were talking about the barriers to some of the achievements you're describing, and I paired it with your opening comment that students don't like this culture of feeling anxious and depressed. And wow, agreed completely. And we've made a ton of efforts at Wake Forest, in some cases bringing in outside folks like Dan Biederman, who created the Bryant Park sort of safe, relaxed spaces to help busy New Yorkers reduce stress and engagement. And still, we keep running up against the broader culture that these amazing young people exist in. One that, as a political scientist, I know we have higher degrees of polarization and mistrust and burnout and mutual suspicion and so on. I love the fact of your class's existence. And again, we try to put some of the same opportunities to uplift in place. And we keep running up against this wider culture. And not to lay down our arms, but how do you think about the kinds of efforts you're describing and the kind you carry out through the curriculum within a culture that's so, alas, antithetical to the improvements we're hoping to achieve?
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought this up, because this is a real frustration for students, right? Because they see this irony writ large. I had petitions from students complaining about why we had grades in our course. And it's because Yale wouldn't let me count a class for credit that didn't have some sort of midterm or assessments of their knowledge, right? But they're like, you're teaching me that grades are gonna, impact my well-being in a negative way. They're gonna impact my learning in a negative way. Why do we have them? And it's like, we tried to do them better, but that was part of it. But and I think there's another spot where students see the hypocrisy too, that I think is really useful for administrators to pay attention to, is that and this comes from some work in psychology, people like Betsy Pollack and others at Princeton have studied, which is like how we build up norms, right? Like, how do you figure out what the norms are? Like, part of it is like who's pursuing certain things and the attitudes that they have. Part is it the structures that you see. But like, one way that we don't pick up on norms is to tell people, like Yale is a place that's committed to your mental health. That does not work to transmit norms at all. What works to transmit norms is like, what's the important stuff at Yale? What gets airtime? What gets a grade? What gets whatever, right? And I think the thing that they find, most annoying is when we give lip service to the well-being stuff. But again, it's like, some 8 o'clock thing on Sunday, 1 week, right? Which is, and the rest of everything, like football gets all this money and all this time, and classes get all this time and all this money. I think they can get really frustrated with that. And I see this even more at the younger levels. As I said, I've been doing lots of talks for like high schools and middle schools and things, and was giving a talk at a very prestigious New England high school. And again, it was like one of these, like the last day of school, Lori comes in, gives this big lecture, and one of the students stood up and he was like, I'm angry at this. Like, I'm a senior. We just spent like the last 3 years killing ourselves to get into college. All the messaging was how important that was. And you're going to come here on the last day of school and tell us that grades don't matter and our sleep matter. Where was that, infused in the rest of this stuff, right? Like, they're not stupid. Like, they're picking up on what we think is the most important. And so then the question is like, what does that structural change look like? I've actually talked a lot with high schools about what that structural change looks like. Because again, I think a lot of these problems start earlier. And they say that they feel like they can't downgrade their rigor, expectations, all this stuff for students for 2 reasons. One is that their students will get into less selective colleges, right? Their numbers will go down and that will look bad. And the second is that they've tried to do this in some cases, but parents have complained. One of the Boston schools I was working with was like, we had 7 hours of homework a night, which I was like, wait. Like, after school, they're like, yeah, on average 7 hours of homework a night. And we wanted to backtrack it to like 5 hours. And they actually got parental complaints because parents said, this is a move to be less rigorous. Our kids are not going to get into Yale as much, right? And so, then the strategy is like, it feels like we've kind of created this arms race of, more, stuff on the admissions file. And I think one way to think about what that would look like would be to scale back. Like, I've actually talked with people in the Ivies about, what would it look like for like the Yale, Harvard, Stanford, Princetons of the world to say, we're going to backtrack. We're going to do admissions this way. Like if you hit a certain SAT or a certain extracurricular threshold, we'll just say, yep, you could get in, and we'll do a lottery. Like if you do more, it doesn't matter, right? Like we're just going to set a limit on what's expected of you. If you hit that, there's not going to be some magic secret formula. We're going to do this. And the terror when you talk to administrators and admissions officers about something like that is they say, well, what if somebody defects? What if Princeton goes and makes like the extra awesome, and then their students are awesome and they get into all the med schools and get all the Rhodes scholarships and all this stuff, right? So I think this is a collective action problem in the way like a nuclear arms race is a collective action problem. And we might really want to think about universities getting together to say, again, this isn't working. It's not working financially because we're dumping tons of money into student services and people to protect this mental health crisis that we in part have created. It's not working in terms of the kind of learning that students are getting because they're not able to learn in the right way. We'd be better at doing our job if we could figure out a way to like backtrack. So, but yes, big structural changes that, I'm putting a Band-Aid on, and students know it's a Band-Aid, and that kind of pisses them off.
This is great. We're getting lots of questions now, so I'm going to have to clump them together, and I think not everybody's going to get called on. So I'm seeing some questions that resonate with the observation that the problem is less about having a weak generation that's not able to cope than it is with the system and with the environment that we've created in college. So let me ask one person who's in this domain that has several of these questions to respond. And this is Nicole Ricardo, who happens to also be at Wake Forest, but they're in the, I think she is involved with the Wellbeing Center there that's been studying this for some time. So Nicole, could you unmute yourself and pose your question?
Yeah, and I think, Laura, you've actually already started to touch on some of these issues. The project that I run is a national survey research project of undergraduate students. And in the course of doing that work, we have lots of conversations with faculty, staff, practitioners, and decision makers. And they say a lot of what you're saying to me, like, we're just trying to keep up with the Joneses, so to speak. And also, I wonder about, until we can figure out this arms race, as you call it, are there things, smaller things that we can start doing on a more moment-to-moment basis to create, even if it's just within our own schools or within our own classrooms, more well-being supportive communities and environments so that students are not having to cope with having more stuff on their resume as undergraduates than I had when I had done like 4 years of graduate school.
Exactly.
So for instance, are there ways that we can be in classrooms with our students? If we have to do tests, are there different ways that we can approach the tests? Are there ways that we can change our interactions with students even? So are there, again, thinking more sort of at the opposite end, are there more granular things that we can do to start to change the environment in the meantime?
Yeah. I think, I think there are definitely. I mean, I think, again, giving students individual strategies is always useful. And we've seen that, with the Coursera data that it seems to be working, at least for adult learners, right? I think anytime the administration can make changes to help with this, it's helpful. But I think one thing that we've seen on our own campus is that kind of, voluntary versions of that don't work as well. So let me give you an example. So Yale has a system that's kind of a pass-fail type system for courses, which they call credit D-fail. I don't know why Yale does everything weirdly, but it's basically like a pass-fail. And, it was the case that those were kind of limited. You could only take a few of them. You had to decide at the start of the semester, and not kind of, halfway through decide you're going to switch to pass-fail and so on. Yale's changed many of those. It now is the case that you at Yale can elect pretty much any class on campus to count as pass-fail, and you could elect it on the last day of classes. So you can literally walk out of your final exam on the last day of classes and be like, that didn't go so well, like pass-fail instead, right? Like that's how easy we have made it for students, right? And very few students do this because they think that there's going to be some consequence in the world for this, right? Like they're reading into what are the kinds of things that incredibly driven people do, and they feel like the pass-fail is like a stopgap. And so I think what we need to do, as much as we don't want to be paternalistic, I think, we've been so paternalistic on bad things for this generation. I think we need a little bit more paternalism, is to like literally set these up. Imagine if Yale said, no, everybody has to take one pass-fail class a semester. It's just required. You got to pick one that's pass-fail, right? they'd be forced to kind of take a break, or they'd be forced to sort of try something that they knew they wouldn't get a grade in, right? I was joking about like we regulate the number of extracurriculars they do, but I don't think that's such a bad idea, right? Like, imagine we put a cap on some of this stuff, right? Like you can't, like we're just preventing you from doing the normal thing you would be doing, which is like chasing all these carrots all over the place. Again, I think the structural changes ahead of time would be better, right? It would be better to kind of give them mindsets where they weren't going for that stuff. But it's really hard for students in the face of this stuff to kind of break from that. And I see that in part because Yale's such an international university. We get students who come with very different backgrounds. Like I remember I had a student from Zimbabwe who took the class who'd like be the kind of student who would like, meet with me for coffee every once in a while, which already tells you he's different than my like type A, busy all the time students. And he said that when he first started, he didn't really understand why we needed a class like this. It felt like a lot of the things I was saying, like sleep, like take a break every once in a while, like they seem like we really need to tell people this. But then over the course of the semester, he was a first year, he said, now I get it. Like when you just soak up this culture, you just feel like, again, these norms transmit. It's like, I'm the only one who's not doing 40 extracurriculars. I'm the only one that's not trying to double major. I'm the only one, right? And they kind of get in there. And so I think the more we could do to like put caps on some of this stuff, regulate it, at least in the short term, it would really help. But ultimately, like the signals are going to come from what's happening about, if med schools and graduate programs and, iBanking jobs don't do something different, it's not going to work. And I think on the lower, unless admissions does something different at the university level, high schools aren't going to be able to change, right? Because they're kind of fighting the same arms race at one level down.
These are great ideas, and they remind me as well that there are opportunities for all of us to set this example, right? We can say to students like, I actually decided not to take that thing or do that extra project or go to the extra thing today. So thank you for sharing these great ideas with us.
And Rick probably knows this well, because I think I scared him. So if you email me, you get my away message where I say, hey, I get way too much email. I'm probably just not going to write back to your email. Here's the stuff I'm going to do. I'm really trying to protect my time affluence. And that means I might not be able to meet with you or get back to you. I'm sorry. But like I've really recognized that I need to follow this stuff too, because if they see me being frantic, that's an instant, that's instant hypocrisy. They can see, again, their norms are set not by what you say, but by what you do. And not all of us at the faculty level are doing a great job with this too. So I think working on our own oxygen masks first might be really essential as well.
This is great. I wish we could go on for 3 hours. Unfortunately, we can't. I'm struggling with too many questions and about 9 minutes left. So I'm going to go next to Maureen Linker, who has an interesting question about intersectionality between students from different groups and how we might think about these lessons applied there. So Maureen, would you unmute yourself and share your question directly?
Sure, and let me begin by saying how much I appreciated this conversation. It was wonderful. So thank you so much, Lori, and thank you, Richard. I'm just thinking, everything you're saying is resonating, and I find it really important and significant. But I am thinking about, I'm at a public regional campus. I have lots of first gen and working class students. I have students who are sort of ethnically and racially diverse, and they're trying to get a leg up. And when I think about things like scaling back credits, I think about the debt that they may be accumulating and the family sacrifices. When I think about, advice about leaving messages that say I'm not available or I need some downtime. And I think even about my colleagues of color who that may be interpreted in ways that could be detrimental professionally. So I'm just, this is sort of a collective question of like, would it be useful for us to collectively think about, what populations are most vulnerable from an intersectional lens? And then how do we sort of work out from there so that the type A high achieving, maybe upper middle class kids who, students who have, clear stressors, but how might it be the case that it's not just catch up for other groups?
Yeah. And I think that, this is really essential, right? Because the way these mental health statistics play out is completely different from an intersectional lens, right? I will say though that, I think there's this definitely all the kids at Yale are very type A, but we actually have a really diverse population. Right now, it's about 20% first generation students at Yale, right? So I think people don't realize that we actually do have populations where this matters. And the way I see this playing out in my own residential college is that like they're kind of caught in the crossfire in a really awful way, right? In the sense that, all these kinds of stressors are playing out, and they additionally have like, and I don't know how I'm going to buy my winter coat, right? Like, I don't know how I'm going to like, pay for my books this semester. I don't have someone who's like able to tutor me for 6 hours a day because, like my parents didn't go to college, right? And so I think that, my experience when working with first generation or students of color, students from these intersectional backgrounds, is that the same stressors are there and worse, right? And so that's why I think these like regulated things might be useful. If we're just like, hey, you're at Yale, but the norm at Yale is that you take this many extracurriculars, right? On the one hand, you might worry like, well, am I giving them less of a college experience? Not if those extracurriculars are killing them, right? Like we can calibrate the amount of work that we want to put in to like a normal amount that's not going to cause them to do harm to themselves to kind of maintain that standard. I think that's the problem, is that, in all domains, we've kind of thought more, like more classes, more extracurriculars, more, but we are passing the threshold where this is useful, especially for our students from vulnerable populations. One of the things I have these meetings with Figley students in our kind of pre-orientation program with them. And, they're all like, well, can I take 6 classes, when the typical version is 4? And I tell them, hey, you got an extra class more than your non-Figley students, because your class is like figuring out what are classes, how am I going to pay for this stuff? Like, how do I tell my family about this? Like, that is a class. Like, that's going to take up 8 hours of your time a week, and you need to leave space for that. And so, again, I think some of these kind of like putting these standards in place could protect these vulnerable populations even more. But it's careful to figure out exactly what you said, right? Like, how do we do that well? How do we do that in ways that aren't read differently for people from certain backgrounds versus others? That's why I think just making them the norm works, right? Like as a biracial woman, I do worry that people see that thing and they're like, well, she's not service oriented. But I'm like, if every faculty had that away message, I wouldn't have to worry about that anymore, because all the white guys would have that too. But yeah, so these kind of norms, we need to think carefully about how they play out. But I think there are ways to do them in ways that aren't like ramping down below what people are paying for, but are giving them what they're paying for and not kind of causing harm at the same time.
This is great. I'm again triaging too many questions and not enough time. I'm going to throw the ball now to Suquant Judge, who is in the provost's office at Arizona State University. And his framing here is about challenges that exist even if you don't have highly selective admissions policies. One of the unique features of this coalition that we're putting together is that it's probably more diverse than any other community of universities that you know of. We're going to have a discussion later this afternoon about, for example, community colleges, historically Black institutions, Ivy Leagues. There are some things that cut across all of these, and it's important to keep that in mind. So Suquant, would you unmute yourself and ask your question directly?
I will. Thank you so much, Dr. Santos. Inspiring work and fantastic talk. So Arizona State University, by its charter, is a very different kind of institution. We believe they'll be measured by not by whom we exclude, but by whom we include and how they succeed. And that drives our design of our learning systems. We have about 136,000 students. We believe in 2 years that number will be 150. And I know from the work that we are doing with our students that the stressors exist for them as much as any other student body. And you responded to this question earlier also. But I see another thing play out in our environment, and I would love to hear your comments on it. That is for first generation students not understanding how a large university works, how an education institution works. And there, the impact of a lot of choice is lack of engagement sometimes. And I would welcome any thoughts you might have for a university of our design that approaches this question in this way. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, that is a reaction that a lot of students have, right? And I think particularly students like who are first gen, who are just trying to understand this place, and then you get too many options and you're like, I'm out. And this is true of any situation where you give people way too many options, right? This is a phenomenon called choice overload, right? It causes people not to pick insurance plans because, you go to your HR and it's like, which insurance plan do you want? And they're like, this 600, you're like, oh, I'll think about that later, right? And then you never engage at all. And so again, I think that, the more we can upfront and personal within the kinds of things that students find important in their lives, as a class or as a thing that seems mandatory, right? To give them these kinds of skill sets or give them these kinds of options for gaining skill sets. That's going to help us out, right? Imagine there's just a mandatory pre-orientation program about sleep, right? Like you don't have a choice. Everybody at ASU takes it, right? And that sets, again, that does two things. One is it makes it not that you're remedial or you need extra help or you're not pushing yourself as hard if you're kind of in the type A student situation. But it also means like, you don't have to worry about it. You don't have a choice. Like the university is signaling that this is important to us and this kind of matters to us. And again, just kind of get back to the point we made earlier, like it does matter, right? Because it is our educational mission to make sure their well-being is doing okay. Because if they're not, then we're not going to meet our educational mission either. Oh, Rick, I think you're muted. Sorry.
We can't thank you enough, Lori, for your sharing today and for the work that you've done for years now. I can't believe you've been teaching for 20 years. You look more like my students than a faculty member. You are so insightful, and your expression of extending what you've learned to universities as a whole is so valuable to us. So thank you so much. I hope you have a great day now, and I look forward to the next chance I have to talk with you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Bye-bye. And you're, of course, welcome to stay if you have time.